So I want to introduce today Jerry Wind. He's our internationally known Lauder Professor Emeritus and Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Wind is one of the most cited authors in marketing. He's consulted with over 100 companies. He's a member of the executive committee at SCI. He sits on advisory boards of various companies and nonprofit organizations, and he testifies in intellectual property cases. He's a 2017 inductee into the Marketing Hall of Fame. Everyone, please welcome Jerry Wind.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It's a delight to be with you. And looking forward to really a fun session. You'll see there is a fair amount of similarity with some of the concepts that you just heard from Jim and some of the stuff that I'll talk about. So hopefully we'll get some convergence validity here and you'll start doing something about it. My objective is very simple, to explore why legacy firms can rarely come up with breakthrough innovations, to explore the case for change and the importance of challenging one's mental model, and suggest primarily 12 guidelines that you can use to try to help you become more innovative. And primarily, the idea will be to discuss the relevance of this guideline for you so you can come up with specific course of actions. So the session will be successful only to the extent that at the end of it, each one of you have at least one idea that you would like to experiment with. It's great to appreciate great ideas. And you nod your head and you feel good about it. And then you go back and you're swamped with work and nothing is happening. And this is stuck somewhere in order. So the idea is if we really want to make this workshop successful, is for you guys to listen carefully. You should get copies of the presentation, so you don't have to take notes of this. And the only notes I want you to take are primarily things that you would like to consider doing. Things that intrigue you, that says, wow, why haven't I thought about this? Why won't I try to experiment with this? The key word here is something that Jim mentioned toward the end of his talk, which is primarily experimentation. And you'll see that the last guideline I'll suggest is the need for continuous experimentation. And every one of the successful companies, we talk about Amazon, Google, Facebook, there's no decision they make without experimentation. And they're doing thousands of experiments all the time. So the key here to start thinking about, as we go through the discussion this morning, what can I experiment with? And try to identify those. And then as we go through, if there are any questions, if things are not clear, raise your hand, let's discuss. So why do you think legacy firms have trouble innovating? Or think about also about yourself. Most of you, there are a few exceptions, are what one may call legacy firms. Why do you think you have difficulty innovating? Too much to lose, okay. Culture. We know what works, right. Okay, any others? Very much so. But let's think about what you're currently doing in the context of the environment we live in. And I'll briefly discuss the enormous advances in science and technology, in the changing media landscape, the most important change, the empowered and skeptical consumers, who incidentally, the skeptical is key because they don't trust you, they don't trust institutions, they're very skeptical and empowered. The disruptive environment within which we live globally. As a result of this, new business and revenue models, and when you look at the combination of all these, huge uncertainties, threats, but also enormous opportunities. There's never been a time in history with more opportunities than we have today. But in order to do it, to capture the opportunities, avoid the threats, and be able to deal with this, you have to start changing. And the one conclusion you can start from the beginning is status quo is not an option. If you're going to continue what you're just doing today, you're most likely going to die. So let's try to quickly review those forces of change. You're probably familiar with all of them, so I'm going to go really fast over them, but stop me if any questions on any of them or if you want to elaborate. So if you think about the advances in science and technology, they probably, with all these changes, some of the most dramatic changes are when you think about AI and quantum computing, and the fact that probably within 2 to 5 years, every one of your customers, every one of your employees, every one of your competitors will have access to a Watson-type knowledge base on their smartphone. And how familiar are you with, let's say, Watson? Familiar with Watson? Anyone is not? Guys, I need feedback because otherwise... You're familiar. Okay, so just imagine that what Sloan Kettering is doing with Watson in terms of medical diagnostic as well as prescribing, deciding what to do, how to treat with situation, based off all the knowledge in the world, in any language, in any mode, is basically going to be accessible to you or your competitors or your customers in any domain that you're dealing with. And I think someone mentioned before that one of the legacy companies that are in deep trouble are universities. Just think about what will happen to universities and learning when every student knows at any given point of time more than the faculty member and more updated data. And just think about the dynamics. Huge changes. And this is changing all the time. And today we're talking about smartphones. It's not obvious that the way of communicating 5 years from now will be smartphone. It might very much be that there will be glasses with augmented reality, that you'll be able to see anything that you're doing a search, you'll be able to see it basically in 3 dimensions in front of you and be able to move the object with your hand as opposed to relying on linear presentation on smartphone. So this is really the game changer. And also there is huge change, obviously, in terms of driven to a large extent with what we know now in the medical area in terms of the whole ability to move into personalization. Just think about personalized medicine, what's happening. Think about the genome revolution that we now have. And fundamentally, these are the forces of change that drives everything that we do. So how many of you feel that you're really on top of the technological changes? Well, let's take for our discussion today, all my questions will be on a 10-point scale. When 1 is nowhere, 10 is I'm really on top of it. How many of you feel that you're 8, 9, or 10 on basically understanding, knowing, and being able to deal with technological changes? 8, 9, or 10, show of hands. Guys, go to work. You cannot ignore it. You cannot ignore it. And so when you start thinking about experimentation, start thinking about, what are of all these major developments that we have in the technological domain, which of them are really critical that I would like to start experimenting with. Okay? The second is basically the exploding, redefined, and enhanced media landscape. We're moving from one-way to two-way, from static to dynamic, from stationary to mobile, from passive to sensing, from one-dimensional to immersive, from visual to multi-sensory. And just think about the way you communicate today with your customers, employees, others. Look how this is changing. So again, on a 10-point scale, how many of you feel that you're really on top of it and experimenting with different ways of thinking about the whole notion of media and communication? So on a 10-point scale, how many are 8, 9, or 10? Wow, that's great. So what do you do?
We're doing with a lot of my clients, we're doing a lot of the experimentation in the travel and tourism industry. So a lot of it is not just before you go, it's while you're in destination. How are we collecting that data? How are we interacting with you? Using mobile, using two-ways, using all of the different sensors.
Are you using augmented reality?
Yes.
Okay, so for that's especially tourism, augmented reality would be an ideal example of basically the way to kind of move and start communicating, making it real. And Gary, what do you do? Incidentally, let me introduce, Gary is the director of Grant for Sculpture. He's our host here and has done an amazing, amazing job with this, with the whole sculpture garden and changing the nature of the place. So kind of, first, thanks for joining us.
Well, no, I think Grounds for Sculpture is sort of a disruptive model for art museums. And so just the multi-sensory experience that, we're having here, we're going to, we're intellectually engaged, we're going to have some food, we're able to walk outside. That immersive multi-sensory is something that we've always led with.
Great example, and you're actually experiencing it, so it's a kind of double benefit of being here. The third area is probably the most critical and most important one, and that's what's happening to the consumer. And I'm talking about consumer here, but it's really, think about people, don't think about consumer. Because consumer is also an employee. He's also a citizen. He's also a father, a mother, a child. Think about the multiple roles that a person plays. So for simplicity, I'll refer to them as empowered and skeptical consumer, but relates to people in all aspects of their life. I'm sharing with you a study which is really old. I published this in 2001. The study was done in 2000. This is now 19 years ago. Now, why am I bringing it? 19 years ago, we found out that consumers, a segment of them, wanted primarily customization and personalization. Make it mine. Some of them wanted it to be part of a community. Let me be part of it. This is way, way before Facebook. They wanted primarily to be able to call, click, and visit anytime, any place. They wanted to primarily get better value for their money before the financial crisis 2008. And they wanted primarily to get tools to help them make better decisions. This is 19 years ago. Today, that's on steroids. From a small segment that was the beginning, what we identify then as the empowered consumer, everyone today is in the empowered consumer area. The challenge is, look at her smile. She doesn't trust you. And that's a huge problem today because the level of trust in institutions, organizations, and businesses is all-time low. Thanks God for politicians. They're the only group with lower level of trust in business. But that's not encouraging for you if you're trying really to engage consumers. So ask yourself the question, do my consumers really trust me? So in terms of understanding the changing dynamic of the consumer, understanding their consumer journey, understanding their needs, wants, frustrations, and ability to address them. On the 10-point scale, how many of you feel that you are 8, 9, or 10? Tell us what you do.
A lot of open-ended surveys. We get almost 100% response to reading every survey, getting back to the customer. Lots of communication. If somebody responds via email or Facebook or whatever the case may be, then somebody gets right back to them.
Okay, that's definitely good. But you do rely on anything else other than surveys? The reason I'm asking the question is, and my background is in research.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I trust surveys.
Well, we only ask open-ended questions.
That's good.
And so every one of those, whether they're saying, hey, I found you, yesterday I had a customer say, I found you on YouTube, first time we've heard that. So immediately I sent an email back and said, hey, which YouTube channel was it? And thank you for the information and send me more information so we can thank them.
That's great. I'm glad you're doing it, but try to augment it. If you try to understand consumers, get engaged with them. Go meet them, speak with them, see how they live, really become an anthropologist. Really try to understand kind of their entire life. And there is an amazing source today, which is by far better than any survey: consumer conversation and social networks. It's an amazing, endless database, continuously updated without being prompted by any researcher. So it's the real thing. We have to be careful because there's a lot of manipulation. People try to manipulate it. There are people who are playing games there. But again, there is a huge database that if we analyze it on an ongoing basis will provide us a lot of insight into it. But it's still not a substitute for having face-to-face interaction with the customer, and definitely not a substitute for taking it to the next level, which will be becoming a partner with the customer, collaborating with the customer, co-creation with the customer, as opposed to just, I'm here and the customer is there. Yeah.
So I'm in the credit card industry, and so a lot of what we do from an acquisition perspective is very much offer-driven. And so there's a tendency to think this is very logical, not emotional. You get the most value, and a lot of things we're testing into now, especially in our own channels, is more of a psychological thing. Fear of missing out. You know others that look like you did this, and giving them more trivia, bite-sized pieces of information that lead them down to a more immersive experience, but not giving it all up front, and testing into different ways to frame things and messaging to get them to
I love that you're experimenting with this. And keep in mind the point that you just made, which is very important, which is the emotional aspect. There are tons of research that shows that consumers are responding by far more powerfully to emotional appeal than cognitive. There is a whole series in the UK about effective advertising with thousands of ads studied. And the conclusions are absolutely clear. Emotion wins every day. Basically, all of us as human beings are much more emotional than cognitive. And so whenever you have to start thinking about an approach, start with emotional appeals and experiment, because small changes can make a huge difference. The third area is the general environment within which we live, the disruptive cultural, social, economic, geopolitical, competitive global environment we're in. And here, basically think about the health divide, the income divide, the digital divide, the educational divide, the climate and sustainability, the intensified competition, huge changes, continuously changes in the environment we live in. Personally, I'm most concerned about the area here, the challenge to democracy, truth, and science. I think that's a huge issue that faces us. And we actually, in terms of, Jim was talking about some of the areas he's passionate about. We just started about a year ago a movement, we call it the Purple Project for Democracy, where we're trying to create a national movement to enhance people's understanding, appreciation, and engagement with democracy and democratic values. It's a nonpartisan initiative, but this is absolutely clear. The data is scary. 98 million people did not vote in the last election. In recent surveys, close to 2/3 of the population believe that a democratic form of government is not important, that a strong leader or even military government is okay. And this is US data, guys. This is scary. And basically what's happening in terms of trust in free press is at all-time low. Talk about trust in institutions. With fake news, no one basically believes anymore the free press, and they don't value it. So we are in deep trouble as a society if we don't have this. But combine this with everything else, combine this with a global view, with the enormous growth of China, India. Africa is coming next in terms of a huge area. We in the US do almost nothing in Africa. Africa is being dominated by China, who is basically have contract to almost all the raw material and basically financing and doing most of their infrastructure. And it's unbelievable what they're doing in terms of also, even in the area of supporting education. And one of the first business schools in Africa is actually sponsored by CEIBS, the China European International Business School, to try to upgrade the quality of management in Africa. So if you're looking in kind of short term, it's probably you have to be in China and India and Asia. If you're looking a little longer term, kind of then Africa is an area that cannot be ignored and really kind of a very important one. Huge, huge implications to everything we do, all these changes. We talk about uncertainty, complexity, change, continuous change, and the like. How many of you feel that on our 10-point scale, 8, 9, 10, that we are really on top of it and take advantage of it? Guys, think global, think broader, think about how do we start addressing some of these issues. And when you talked about purpose, the whole, a key point of the discussion of Jim before, what does purpose mean? Purpose means that we're having a positive social impact on society. What will be more of a positive social impact than being able to solve these problems? So understanding this actually provides you a guideline. What do we mean by purpose? How do we really move forward in this whole area? And keep in mind the data that Jim shared with you, that the millennials want primarily to work for companies that have a positive social impact, and they want to buy products from companies, products and services and experiences from companies that are advocating this. So keep this in mind. Now, as a result of, yeah, please.
What do you mean by co-opetition being a threat?
It's not necessarily a threat. Everything here is, every one of this is a threat and an opportunity. And that this is a trend which is moving away from just the traditional competition. Because increasingly you have, think about two major rivals, Apple and Samsung. They buy products from each other. So while they're competing vigorously in the marketplace for smartphones, they also have a strong business relationship between the two of them. And that's what you start seeing is that it's not the traditional competitive world. These are my competitors, my enemy and the like, but how do you start thinking about how can I start collaborating with them? And it's increasingly, as we're dealing with not just looking at a firm by itself, but a firm as part of a network and part of an ecosystem, you start realizing that you have to start forming specific strategic alliances or other cooperative relations, even with your competitors. Any other questions? Comments? Okay. As a result of these four forces of change, the dramatic change in technology and scientific development, in the media, in the empowered and skeptical consumer, and in the business environment, there is a whole need to rethink the business models we have. And very quickly, I'll go through some of these kind of new business models. The first one is a customer-driven, holistic model. The idea here is very simple. The idea here is that as opposed to starting by saying, here's my product, now who will be my customers or potential customers, and what do I do to try to reach them effectively, let's start not with the product in the center, but with the customer in the center, understand their evolving needs, and then saying what product, services, and most importantly today, what experience, so augment the product and service with experiences, will address their evolving needs, and then only then go to, okay, so what do I have to do in terms of strategy, infrastructure, and the like to try to allow me this? How many of you are basically in Model 1 today? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, that's not too many, only about 5 or 6, that's good. How many of you are in Model 2? And some of you are in between, nowhere? Between? Okay, guys. Those of you who are there, or those of you who are in between, forget it. Forget it. This will not help you address the changes we're talking about. This is basically the driving model you should move toward. Because it might be, the minute you start looking at this, might be very much that the current product that you have is the wrong solution or partial solution, and how do you have to rethink and reinvent and move it. Second model is primarily taking us from what I mentioned before, from a customer centric point of view, not only doing the research and finding out what they want, but engaging them with us as co-creators. And there are a lot of research that's showing that basically the more you engage the customers in the development of the product and service, the higher the likelihood that the product and service will be successful. There is a little risk here, and the risk is that some of the customers, if you look in terms of diffusion of innovation, and this is time, and this is basically the acceptance, if you want to, of product and services in the marketplace, and they're typically a diffusion function. There are some innovators here who are will be the first one to innovate the product, then will be the early adopters, kind of late adopters, and so on. At the end, you have kind of the laggards, those who kind of eventually may join you. The challenge is that the people who are likely to work with you on co-creation are typically the innovators. But if the innovators are really a distinct segment that have different needs than the others, then the product you develop for them will not be appropriate for these guys here. That's basically was termed years ago as the chasm, basically, that can exist here. To try to avoid this, what should you do? To avoid the chasm while maintaining the value of co-creation, what should you do? Test what?
Test slowly what all the different innovations without changing completely one to the other. Just test something.
Test is like aspirin. It's always good. Aspirin, tea, love, this is always good. So I will never say no whenever you say experiment. But just let me modify one word here. I just don't want test, just doing something. I want an experiment. And I want experiment because experiment assures that I have a controlled experiment and I can basically attribute whatever I'm doing to a cause. It's the only way to determine causality is through experimentation. So when we talk about test, as long as you think about experimentation with appropriate control, I love you. But it's not enough. The solution here is to select customers from all segments and basically co-create with all of them. So try to think about this, because otherwise you may be able to develop a great product, but only for a very limited segment, which will not be able to scale. Stop me if there are any questions, any kind of the item we're going through. Open innovation, are you familiar with this? Yes. Open innovation, well, okay, let me give you a quick example. Open innovation, I assume that all of you are using software. And many of you are probably hiring people to develop your software, right? What is the likelihood that you will get really a top-notch software developer, be able to hire them? I would say probably close to zero. And the difference between the kind of the top-notch software developers and the average one, so if you think about software developers, the kind of the natural curve, and you have an average one, and you have a top-notch software developers here, the extreme. What do you think is the difference in productivity between these two?
10x.
You got it. It's exactly 10x. Very, very well documented. Your likelihood of getting one of these is close to zero. Unless you're NASA or Google or Facebook, and even some of these don't want to work for them. They want to work independently. So if you have to deal with software development, as opposed to hiring these guys, let's say you're going to a network called TopCoder. TopCoder has over 1 million truly top coders, top software developers in their network. You specify what you need, they send it to their network. They may have 300, 400, whatever the number of people who work on this. The winner is the one that you pay for. You pay only for results. So as opposed to hiring a mediocre person who's giving you average results and you're paying for full time for all the time they're wasting on this, you're getting here the best of the best and you're paying only for results. It's a no-brainer solution. That's the most breakthrough kind of concept in today's management. And it applies in all domains, not only in software development, it applies in every domain you're dealing with. So in the advertising world, for example, there was a company called Victor and Spoils that within a very short period of time was able to develop over 7,000 creatives. So when you need advertising, you send it to them, and they had hundreds of creatives come up with the idea, and then they basically went with this. So very, very powerful concept. How many of you are using open innovation? Start to. Guys, if you're not, kind of add to your list, start experimenting with this. Whatever else you select, this is a must. That's a game changer. Just think about this. You get it by far better talent, which will give you the results much faster and much better, at a fraction of the cost because they're paying only for results. You're not paying for all the wasted time and energy of mediocre people that you have to hire. And you change dramatically the way you're thinking about basically, kind of talent and how do you deal with talent, which means you're moving away from just recruiting to start thinking about how do I attract the talent, both either to be with me or through open innovation. Yeah.
Wouldn't you consider Merck to be a good example of that, having a closed innovation model and then moving into that open innovation model?
Yeah, Merck is using it. Merck, Eli Lilly are all using, basically, I'm not sure they're using this more as a competition. So they announce, especially in the clinical area, they announce, here's a clinical problem we have. Actually, Merck, there is a great example. About a year ago, they announced it was like $28,000 clinical problem. The winners were 3 computer scientists from MIT who won it. Now, the interesting thing about open innovation, and the reason you all should consider it as a must thing, is the following finding. Innocentive is one of the early companies that were aggregate of talent from many, many domains and disciplines. And they did a study a few years back, that's now probably about a 3-4 years old study, of what happened, kind of what are the results of their activity as open innovation company. So they found 2 findings. One is they were able to solve 40% of the problems that they got. Guys, think about this. This is a huge number. This is 40% of problems. The companies like P&G, who's used them at the time. P&G has thousands of R&D people, and the problem that they could not solve, they sent to Innocentive, and they solved 40% of the problem. It's a huge number. Second finding, and the most important one, is the following. The further the discipline of the problem solver from the discipline of the problem, the higher the likelihood of success. Which means if it was P&G or let's say Merck, and they sent them a medical problem, it was not the medical experts who had the higher likelihood of solving the problem, it was the non-medical experts. Because every discipline they're getting is so narrow and basically so biased by the assumptions, the constraints, and everything else, so they cannot see the solution. So people from other disciplines can do it. No one here is rich enough, big enough to be able to hire people in all disciplines. So the only chance you have, if you really have a difficult problem in any domain you're dealing with, to try to solve it is by going to open innovation and start getting then the talent from other disciplines that otherwise you don't have access to. So that's the reason I'm saying that's a no-brainer. The open innovation is a no-brainer requirement to rethink whatever you're doing today. Yeah, Mark.
Where do you find out about where you can contact different organizations within that do the open innovation model for different disciplines?
I have a slide coming out a little further. It's one of the guidelines. One of my guidelines is use open innovation. So there are some examples there, like Innocentive, like Top Coder, and others. And then just basically, if you go on the social network, you'll find out there are a lot of groups, and there are then a lot of competitions, and there are a lot of kind of ecosystems that are being developed in different industries and different areas. Questions, comments? Next one is network orchestration model. The idea here is that primarily no organization, and that's kind of an extension, if you want to, of the open innovation, can have all the talent that they need to solve problems today. And in today's environment, it's really becoming kind of almost like networks, and how do you create a network? And the competition is going to be, in a sense, network against network and not company against company. So your strength is really part of your ecosystem. So if you think about the open innovation for a minute, Apple is a great example. Apple is offering hundreds of thousands or millions of apps. How many of them do you think they develop? None. But they created a developer network. And they have an incredible network of developers and created the process and the model for this. So any developer, so if Gary wants to develop a new app for art lovers, and he will then go to Apple and will be on the Apple store, and he'll decide on the price, Apple will just take, once they approve it, they'll just take 30% of whatever price you decided. It's a wonderful revenue model. But basically, they have the benefit of the network. So increasingly, the business model you start focusing on is that of a network orchestrator. How do you orchestrate kind of a network? So we did a study. We published this about 2 years ago in a book, The Network Imperative. And we looked at 4 business models. The 4 business models was the first one was basically a traditional type of let's say, of a manufacturer, retailer, which is primarily, this is a asset-based. You primarily have an asset. You have a factory. You have a retail operation like. So, kind of basically, you have an asset-based model that generates the revenue. The second one is more along the line of, if you want to, of the service. Consulting firms can be here. The third one is the one where you start creating some type of intellectual property, some IP. So this can be pharmaceutical companies that develop or software developer companies. And the fourth one will be the networks, the network orchestrators, the Uber, the Airbnb, the one that are leveraging a network of operation. And then we ask the simple question, which is, okay, what is the market value of these 4 business models? And we looked at the market value as a multiple of revenues. And the data from about 2 years ago when we published the book was for the asset builders, it was 1. For the service provider, it was 2. For the IP developers, it was between 3 and 4. And for the network orchestrator, it was 8+. Market value as a multiple of revenues. Guys, no brainer, think about a network. Every one of you have a network. Every one of you have a network of clients, former clients, employees, partners, distributors, and others. The challenge is, how do you energize the network? And how do you monetize the network? Okay? So the idea here, in terms of starting about business models and revenue models, is how do we move now toward start leveraging the network orchestration model? Question?
So one of the core initial founding purposes of the NetElixir's experience was essentially utilizing and building the knowledge ecosystem as such. So that was, I think, one of the things. Have we really sort of progressed as much as we should have? Probably no. But I think that was one of the founding core ideas behind this thing. But it can be really, really powerful.
Which makes a lot of sense. Because if you can, in a sense, you're creating a network and sharing the knowledge here, and then to what extent, as a network, you can start increasing the value of the network. Yeah.
Any possibility for that to change? The network orchestrators may lose that. The reason why I'm asking is, can anyone be a network orchestrator? The fact is that let someone be a network orchestrator and anyone others. The traditional power should changes.
Given the rapid changes in technology and science, and the fact of what's happening with the consumer dynamics as a result of this, everything can change. But in today's environment, And if you look at the track record of network kind of orchestrators and what they're doing to try to expand, just look at how, for example, Airbnb is expanding. And then the question is, the Airbnb model, why am I leaving it only for in the hotel area? You know, look at the success they had in the hotel. But BMW is experimenting now with an Airbnb model for cars. So the next BMW you're going to buy, they'll give you an option. So between 9 and 5, when your car is in the garage because you work, can you lease it out to someone else? So it's moving in other areas. So nothing is static. And you'll see as we kind of proceed that basically a lot of the innovations and change are also among the new economy firms. So we're talking about here is not limited only to kind of the legacy companies have to worry about, but also them. So yeah, most likely will change, but in today's environment and foreseeable future, if I had to bet here on things, I definitely will bet on these four. They're almost like they're a no-brainer type thing that you have to move toward. That's what we know today that works. Competitive value model is the straightforward old model, but there is one twist here. Historically, it was viewed that you can have either better product or cheaper product or faster product, but there were primarily what trade-off among them. In today's kind of capabilities and ability to rethink what you do, there doesn't have to be a trade-off. You can design new systems that will be faster, better, cheaper, as opposed to selecting one of them and hoping that you're in parity on the others. So I think we need a shift in our thinking and moving away from the fact that it has to be kind of either or. I have to choose among the three and start focusing on how do I deal with all three of them. Tons of new revenue models, and you should be on top of them. Just look at primarily the media, publishing in terms of revenue model they have, how moving away from advertising to subscription and others. And in every one of your industries, every one of your companies, ask yourself the question, when was the last time I really examined my revenue model? Is my revenue model still relevant? You know, for some reason, revenue model has become something once you decide on is very difficult to change. But the reality is if you change your business model, you change some of the other thing we're talking about, nothing sacred about the revenue model. The revenue model should be examined and should be changed, you know, at least subject to change. So think about exploring this. Transformation to full service provider is the best way to show it would be through an example. Think about IBM. And think about IBM in a historical perspective. Let's go from the 60s on. From the 60s to the 90s and on. How do you think IBM measured themselves? What was their key criteria for performance? From the 60s, let's say. Be a little more specific. Be more specific. No. They looked at very simple measures. Share of mainframe. And their management tapped themselves on the shoulder every morning and says, yeah, we are terrific, because during this entire period, their share of mainframe was around 90%. But what do you think happened during this entire period? Mainframe were not the only game in town. And if you look at share of the one that they should have looked at, which was share of computing, all money spent on computing by companies, their share of computing went like this, straight line down, because they were looking at the old market they had. Took Gerstner to take them and say, whoop, let's change and start looking at share of computing. And today, basically, hardware is less than 10% of the IBM budget. You know, if you start thinking about primarily the chain. So the idea here is move away from thinking about traditional market share. You ask yourself the question, can I start measuring myself on share of wallet? How many of you measure yourself on share of wallet? Only 3. Guys, think about this. 4. Okay, we haven't heard from you. What is your measure of share of wallet? What product and what is the share of wallet?
I work for Google, and so we look at advertisers, where else they're spending, performance engagement.
All promotional money. Terrific. And you're doing?
Yeah, we do look at market share from a credit card perspective, but we also look at our engagement of customers, where we're top of wallet, where the off-us spend is, and use that to size the opportunity to go get it.
So guys, think about this because it will change your whole view of what your objective should be, what your strategy should be, what customers should focus on, who are your competitors. Because I was thinking about Gary. Gary's share of market, market share among sculpture parks, can be very high. But think about in terms of share of wallet of the money and time that all your potential customers spend on all entertainment and all way of the way they spend their time, and your share is a tiny one. And then the question, okay, how do I grow this share because this is a more meaningful share? This will give you tons of new ideas in terms of how do you expand your product and service offering and the experience you provide the customers.
This is the same concept, Jerry, I'm sorry, as Theodore Levitt's marketing myopia as well, right?
Yeah, think about
in terms of how you define this.
But he defined it still, if you think about this, he moved from railroad to transportation, which was a big move at the time. But today, we're talking about more than functional area of transportation. Today, you have to think about basically almost the time. If you were in the railroad business, what is the right measure? Is it just transportation, or is it something else? And and what is the experience you're trying to create? So he was absolutely in the right direction by moving from railroad to transportation. But what can we do in terms of saying, what is the relevant wallet for us? And I think the Google example is a great one in this respect. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Airbnb before. The hospitality industry is reinventing itself because it has to. So back to co-opetition, they're approaching Airbnb and saying, well, we have restaurants and we have pools and we have centers right by where the Airbnbs are. Can we lease these out to your guests? Because they're asking for full service. We have it. We can't get it from our customers. They're working during the day and they'll use it. So all of a sudden, a completely new revenue model is forming by the co-opetition of Airbnb and hard assets, hospitality.
Great example. And not to kind of just rely on this, Airbnb started buying hotels. So that's a great example for the dynamic nature. So I cannot tell you how long it will be, but I know in today's environment, if you had to start thinking about revenue models and business models, start thinking about these type of business models. Yeah, please.
My experience shows too that when you look at it this way, this also becomes the case for doing things that may look cannibalistic to your existing business. Because if you're looking at it from a full share perspective, without looking at it that way, you may say this will cannibalize what I think I have here. But if you realize, nothing is static, right? So if you keep doing the same thing, that business you have will eventually get eroded. So it's been used, in my experience, to help build the case where we got to go where it's staying, we feel scared, because that's where our customers are.
I think it's a great point, and let me emphasize one key word that you mentioned, which is cannibalization. Remember, if you will not cannibalize yourself, the competitors will cannibalize you. So what would you rather be? And the best example for a company that consistently was able to deal with this effectively was Intel. Every mall that Intel came cannibalized its previous malls. And they did it basically and designed it in a very, very smart way. So don't be afraid of cannibalization, because if you won't do it, someone else will do it for you. 8 was basically the emerging market innovation engine. And the only point I want to mention here is stop thinking about the US as the only source of innovative ideas and approaches. The amount of innovation that occurs to the end. You actually mentioned this in your introductory comments in terms of the changes that we saw in China, the changes we see in India. There is a concept of frugal innovation that primarily characterized a lot of the innovations in India. And I'll give you one example. It's an old example, but it illustrates, how we have to start respecting and make sure that we are on top of what's happening in other parts of the world in terms of innovation. Think about not a very pleasant topic, but think about a prosthetic. So a leg prosthetic in the US is about $8,000 to $10,000 and required hospitalization. In India, they developed a leg prosthetic which is better functionally than the US one, which allows people to work in the field. And it costs, you ready for this? $50. 8 to 10,000 compared to $50 with no hospitalization, and it's a dramatically different and better solution. When you start thinking about this magnitude of difference, you realize how critical it is that whatever you're doing innovation-wise, you should start thinking about in a global context. And in today's environment, especially with the communication ability and with time difference zones, if in the R&D, if any of you are in the R&D area, an ideal solution would be, for example, to have an R&D center in the US, in India, and if you want a third one, in Israel, where you have a huge kind of high-tech and huge number of startups. And if you have those three centers, you can basically come not only with faster solutions, but you basically have a feel for what's happening in terms of other innovation centers and come up with more ideas. So it really forces you almost to start thinking about also in terms of global kind of way of managing, the whole innovation process. The big corporation is really a growing phenomena and very consistent with what Jim was talking about in terms of a purpose. Big corporations are increasing in their importance, and all they're doing is, and that's a direct follow-up to the discussion with Jim this morning, they're primarily focusing not only on profit, but equally important on having a positive social impact. How many of you, incidentally, anyone here is B corporation? Great. What's been your experience?
We're funding one of the co-founders of the B Corp. We do sustainable children's organic clothing wear, and it's a fantastic journey. The CEO who's driving this has a total transform in terms of how do you make an impact in every decision that you make, right? From the farmer to the weaver to the customer, and how do you communicate that journey across?
That sounds great. All of you should think about this, whether you move formally into a B corporation form or not, but the whole discussion of purpose, that's basically where the rubber meets the road in a term of when you're saying, what's the objective of the firm? What are we trying to accomplish? And realizing that you really have to be a stakeholder-driven and not only shareholder-driven, and focus on all the stakeholders that you're dealing with. The final one is the shift to digital and network business models. And the idea here is that given what we have today, it's no longer a world where we can think about digital separately. I don't believe any company should focus only on saying, we're great at our digital strategy. I don't believe there is a digital strategy. Digital is an integral part of the strategy that you have. If you think about retail, and there's a lot of discussion with retail before, retail has to be an omni-channel. You cannot have today a retail operation unless you're omni-channel, unless you're providing a seamless experience to the consumer in all the channels that the consumer wants. So I think fundamentally it is we have to think about this as an integral part of what we're doing. So it's not either or, but it's primarily the end, and how do we come up with the best omni-channel solution, which has to be reflected in the business model. Questions on any of the business models? Okay. Yeah.
So, do are there cases where these business models overlap? Because some of these seem to be overlapping.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. There's components of this. And I think that everyone, basically, there is no way you should avoid doing all four of the first row here. And then components of the others that you have here.
Because if you sort of
right?
But they are also using the network orchestration.
Absolutely. So yeah, these are not distinct malls. These are malls that are there, and we have to put them together. It's really a portfolio of malls. But I think in general, there have been not enough attention given to business malls and more attention on the offering that we want to do. And I'm suggesting we have to start combining the two and paying more attention and focusing also on innovation in the business. We talked about rethinking innovation. Part of the rethinking innovation is rethink the business model, because innovation applies to everything we do, not only in terms of coming up with a new product or service. So the case for change, I'll go very, very quickly over this. You have the slide later, so you can look at this. Of the Fortune 500 firm in 1955, basically close to 90% do not exist anymore in the Fortune 500. Only actually 10.4% are still on the Fortune 500. And if you want a more recent data from 2000, 19 years ago, actually data we have for 17 years. In 17 years, only 52% of the Fortune 500 companies in 2000 were still on the Fortune 500 in 2017. So if they want statistics for the case for change, that's the one. And the one did not survive is primarily because they did not change, because they stayed with the status quo. Status quo is not an option. Just look at different industries. Think about what's happening in cell phones. Think about all the big names, the Motorola, Nokia. 20 years ago, if we had this meeting, everyone would have had a Nokia phone. Today, no one has a Nokia phone. Think what happened in terms of hotels. We talked about Airbnb before. Look at the amazing growth of Airbnb. And this is before they started the acquisition of strategic alliance with hotels. So see what it will move, and think also what Airbnb will do to expanding to other areas. Think about photography, Kodak. The inventor of digital photography is dead. They invented it, but they were afraid of cannibalization, so they kept the old film business. Look where they are, compared to what's happening today in terms of the advanced smartphones, drones, wearables, all way of photography. Think about shopping in terms of the dominance of Amazon and Alibaba. And we haven't even seen the beginning of the impact of Alibaba in the US market. And they are a powerhouse in terms of especially all the acquisitions and investment that they're doing in many, many areas. Consider movies, what's happening in terms of streaming. Look at kind of all the new players here that you have in the movie area. Consider car services in terms of Uber and the like, and their growth compared to the traditional kind of yellow cabs. Consider in cars the next generation in terms of autonomous cars, autonomous development. And that's a little chart I created in terms of just reflecting some of the current alliances and partnerships and investments that's happening across different companies in this area. Everyone is moving into the autonomous car area in the amazing opportunities that exist here. Consider music in terms of streaming, what's happening in terms of the new versus the old. We have to look at all the changes we talked about, not as a threat by itself, but as an opportunity. How do you turn this around into kind of a great opportunity? So why do you think legacy firms cannot really be successful innovators? From discussion, because they protect the past, because they risk avoid and primarily lack of understanding that the real risk is not to change. It's by far more risky to stay with the status quo than to experiment with others. The riskiest action you have is staying with what you have done before, given the change in the environment. And one of the reasons is because people have old mental models, and we'll touch about this point in a minute. And there's a lack of sense of urgency, unfortunately. Especially the larger the company, the more successful the company, the less is the sense of urgency. And so it's almost a kind of the wrong type of relationship here. But every large company or small company, regardless of the size of company, regardless of industry, given the changes in the environment we just spoke about, you really should have a sense of urgency and be willing to change what you have. And another major problem with many successful companies is arrogance. What do I mean by mental model? So let me give you a little story and then kind of we'll continue from there. So imagine that it's almost midnight and I'm walking to my car, which is a few blocks away. And suddenly I hear steps behind me. Something that knocks, steps behind me. And I remember a news story that talked about a robbery at knife point in this area. So I walk faster, but the steps behind me also walking faster. Now, what do you think at this moment, what I'm thinking? What is my panic? I'm in danger. Someone's going to attack me, right? I'm probably breathing hard. I'm walking faster. Everything, my feeling, behavior, everything is functional of this mental model. There's a light. I'm turning around, and suddenly I see it's a colleague of mine from the same place walking the same direction. So with a sigh of relief, I say hi, and we continue together. What's the new mental model? A relief, fun. Now we can talk. The moral of this little story is, everything we do, everything our employees do, everything our competitors do, everything is function, not of reality. The reality is, in our little story, that my, the same, kind of co-worker walked behind me the entire time. But everything I did, including being scared stiff, walking faster, behavioral manifestation of this, everything was a function of the mental model I created in my mind that I'm going to be attacked. Nothing to do with reality. It's the mental model that was driving what I do. And that's what's happening to all of us. So let's look at a few examples. Let's think about inner city. How many of you would invest in the inner city? Depends, but I don't see too many hands here. Because inner city, the mental model, crime, drug, poverty, right? Now, how many of you would invest in emerging markets? Now I suddenly see a whole slew of hands and smiles on your faces. Because emerging markets suggest what? Opportunities. What if I change the name of inner city to emerging domestic markets? Well, emerging domestic market is exactly the same level of crime, poverty, drugs as inner city. But people are investing a lot of money in emerging domestic markets because the mental model is different. Take another example. Think about a Western-trained physician. What do you think their attitude toward alternative medicine will be? Negative, right? Well, a hospital not too far from here, Jefferson Hospital, about 15 years ago or so, instituted a new department of complementary medicine. All the physicians voted for it, and now they're sending patients to the complementary medicine department. Complementary medicine is exactly the same practice as alternative medicine. But the name is not threatening. It's not an alternative. It is complementary to the kind of traditional kind of Western medicine. And the last example, think about Roger Bannister. Roger Bannister, how many of you incidentally heard of him? Oh, that's good. Well, he broke the 4-minute mile barrier in 1954, a barrier that until then was believed to be a physical barrier, that no human being can run faster than the 4-minute mile. The minute he broke it, in the next 18 months, there were a number of others, almost close to a dozen runners, that broke the 4-minute mile barrier because they all realized the 4-minute mile barrier was a mental barrier, not a physical barrier. I would argue that all of us have both our individual and organizational 4-minute mile barriers. We believe that a certain thing cannot be done. Let's identify what are these 4-minute mile barriers that we have and try to break them. And it finally, in terms of kind of we cannot avoid kind of the political realm. But if you look at party affiliation, or at least declaring party affiliation as a surrogate for a mental mal, look at the approval rating of the president. The president does whatever he does, so that's the reality. How is it perceived? Positively by 6% of Democrats, 37% of independent, and 89% of Republicans. Everything is a function of the mental mal. And when you think about this, all these innovations. So there's like a random selection of innovations, all the way from, we have the Airbnb, but Cirque du Soleil, $2,000 car, Apple, the Home Depot, tons of innovation. What's common to all these innovations? One thing is common to all the innovations in all these different industries. They all change the mental mal of their industry. They all change the mental mal of their industry. How many of you here feel that your company, other than Google, changed the mental mal of their industry? Guys, that's the ultimate measure. We have two. Give us the example, because that's the ultimate measure for innovation. When you change the mental mal of the industry, you offer a totally new way of approaching, thinking, experiencing the product, services, and experience. So share with us briefly what you're doing.
We have to continue to innovate, but when we started out, we shipped supplies through the mail. At the time, we were blacklisted by a lot of distributors, do not sell to these people, they sell direct because they skip distribution.
And you?
We were the first to sell custom picture frames in the mail direct to the artist. Bypassing the frame shop.
Great. Right, good examples. And obviously, we all know about Google, how they changed the whole world. So the idea is, if you really want to be innovative, start by asking the question, what is the mental mal of my industry? And two, how can I change the mental mal of my industry? Very, very simple. So the key point is that in the changing environment, challenging and potentially changing our current mental mal is a must. And interesting, our friend Einstein, whose picture is there, said years ago, without changing our pattern of thought, we will not be able to solve the problems we created with our current patterns of thought. So simple and articulate. Questions on mental mals? Okay, so this is one of my favorite cartoons. The king is fighting a war with common sword and spears. Someone comes with a better innovation. This machine gun is a little more efficient. But the king says, no, I can't be bothered to see some crazy salesman. I've got a battle to fight. How many of you feel that when you're trying to sell something, that's the reaction of the customer? Now, the challenge is, do you really have a machine gun which is so much better than the traditional swords and spears? But this reflects the reluctance of so many organizations to really change the mental mal and be able to move forward. So the message at this stage is, we really have to ask the question, what's our mental mal today? What's the mental mal of the industry? And can we change it? And how can we change it? Because you do have to change it. At the minimum, you have to challenge it. But I would say that ideally, you should really try to change. Now, let's start by asking the question, what is your mental mal of innovation? We're here for innovation. The whole theme is innovation. So what is the mental mal of innovation? So let's do the following. Since it's so quiet in the room, let's take 3 minutes at the tables, and each table discuss what do you think is your mental mal of innovation. And then we'll hear from the tables. Okay, table discussion time. Great. So these are really great kind of reflections of kind of different approaches today to innovation. Let's try to expand it a little bit. I think everything here kind of makes sense, especially when we start thinking about focusing on the problem, focusing on the clients, kind of experimenting with different things. Again, experimenting as opposed to just testing. But let's try to see what else we can do here. One of the key things I would like you to think about that is innovation the responsibility of everyone in the organization related to any domain, or is it kind of limited to there is the innovation group here? And I think it's an important decision, and I think the way I would like to look at innovation and rethinking innovation is that it's the responsibility of everyone. Regardless of the position, it's your responsibility to innovate, to challenge the model that you currently have in whatever you do, regardless where you are in the organization. And every aspect of what you do, if it's important, you should be a subject to innovation. So we're not talking about creating a little kind of an innovation group out there in the organization. We talk about rethinking innovation in a way that it applies to everyone in the organization, for every position, for every activity. Okay? Kind of a little expanding it from the traditional way of looking at this. We talked about the mental models, and I'll briefly just kind of highlight few things that can be used to try to challenge current mental models. Like primarily look at customer insight and engage the customers will help you challenge your mental models. Or set stretch objectives. Stretch objective is defined as something you cannot achieve with your current approach. So a stretch objective has to be defined in such a way that you will not be able to achieve it if you just continue doing what you're currently doing. So for example, doubling your share of wallet in 3 years, this can be a stretch objective, as opposed to, let me increase my revenue by 5%. Develop an idealized design. That's an important area because most planning is forward planning. What I'm doing, what I've done historically, and how do I move forward. Idealized design say, no, let's approach it differently. Let me identify an ideal where I want to be. So if this is kind of time, identify where do I want to be if I'm here. And then what's called idealized design will lead to backward planning and saying, okay, how do I get from where I am here to this ideal, as opposed to just taking the history of what I've done here and try to project it forward and come up with different options here. So idealized design is really an important way of rethinking what we're doing. Bring the radicals in is an interesting example because historically, if someone comes with a radical idea, the initial reaction will be, let's fight them. So imagine that you're IBM and open source was introduced. What do you think the reaction of IBM will be to open source? No way, right? Bring the lawyers, let's sue them. Just think about what the record companies did with when basically kind of a threat came, Napster came, right? Sue them. No, but IBM had a very smart head of R&D at the time, and they said, don't sue them. Let them bring them in. Let's find out what they're doing. And as a result of this, actually, IBM decided to adopt open innovation, open source, and build proprietary software on top of open source, which changed dramatically what IBM has done. So we call this bring the radicals in. So if someone threatens you, don't necessarily sue them, bring them in, see if you can work with them. Destroy the brand is a great approach. This is a very fast approach. Get 5 of your people who do not report to you if you're the brand manager, set them out for dinner and encourage them to even have good wine and give them one assignment. If you were a competitor and you tried to destroy the brand, what would you do? It's amazing. We've done it in about 17 cases in different industries, and we found out in every one of these with one dinner, they come back the next morning and give you a whole set of ideas of how a competitor can destroy the company. And then what you have to do is basically spend the rest of the day saying, okay, how do we defend against it? What do we do? But it's a cheap, fast, amazing way of doing, especially if you select the right group of people to do it, the dinner, if they're not necessarily without reporting kind of ahead of the brand who basically say, no, we cannot do it, or this has been done. by bringing people who are willing to challenge it. Great experience with this. And the final approach will be kind of zooming in and out and primarily listens for winners and losers. The idea is take any problem that you have. You talked about the problem initially. Let's look at this from different perspective, close in and out, in a broader perspective, and see how you can solve it. So these are some kind of, since we talk about mental models, some quick guidelines what to do about this. But questions about any of these? Okay, so let's move to the core of our discussion, 12 guidelines. The good news is that we covered a number of these ideas, so we'll be able to go fast. But the idea will be, as we go through each one of them, I want you to reflect, can I use this guideline? And if you feel you cannot use it, raise up the question, why can't I use it? And let's discuss it. The first one is focus your innovation initiative on emerging customer needs and wants. I want to highlight here 3 things. The customer journey. Focus on the customer, understanding the customer journey. Second, ask yourself the question, how can you basically capture the trust, the consumer trust in whatever you're doing? Because if you won't have it, it will not work. And 3, start thinking about what I believe is the trend of the future, which is real-time personalized experience. And I'll give you an example of what actually is happening today. So this is not science fiction. This is happening today. I'll give you 2 examples. One example is up here. It was developed by Deloitte, and let's say for a shoe company. What they're doing is they're monitoring the social networks in real time. And as they identify, for example, let's say Gary is putting a post, something about Madonna, that Madonna said. And Gary has a huge following, and Madonna has a huge following. They can immediately analyze the projected life cycle of this message. Will this be a cultural trend or not? They can do it in real time. So they just keep up the message, do an analysis based on all the data they have of the social network. Will it be a social trend or not? Let's say decide it is. Then they take an ad, a structure of an ad for a given product, modify the ad to reflect the cultural trend. So let's say Madonna talked about cats, and suddenly the assumption is cats will be now everywhere there. So they take the ad and create an ad involving a cat. And then they customize it for the specific segment that this brand has, and issue the ads for the specific segments based on the cultural trend. All of this is being done within 1 day. So at the end of the day, based on this real-time analysis, an ad that goes out for a given brand reflects the cultural trend, customized for the segment they're dealing with. That's a reality today. Can be done because of predictive AI, of the analysis of the social networks. A slightly less sophisticated approach, but still in the same direction, is a slide that on one of the early slides, I had a picture of MasterCard and American Airlines. So imagine the following situation. You bought a ticket from here to San Francisco. MasterCard has all the information about your preferences. They know you like Chinese food, you like contemporary art, and you like boutique hotels. The minute you bought the ticket to San Francisco, you're getting an offer from MasterCard that says, there is a new Chinese restaurant. Would you like us to make a reservation for you there? There's a new boutique hotel very close to the San Francisco MoMA, which has a great show. Would you like us to make a reservation in the hotel and get you a ticket for the show? In real time, you get a message. Also something that exists today. This is the trend. So guideline number 1 is, if you want to innovate, make sure that you focus on emerging consumer needs and wants, but in real time, capitalizing the technology that we have that I just gave you with these 2 examples, and try to create a real-time personalized experience, and what will it take for us to innovate to try to do it. Questions?
Do you think that GDPR is going to have an effect on the opportunity for marketers to do this type of personalization especially when it comes to purchases?
Well, this relates directly to the question of trust, relates directly to the question of, basically, to what extent consumers will give you permission. Consumers, basically, the younger generation are much less sensitive than the older generation. And second, if you offer a real benefit, people will do it. The two examples I gave you were of a real benefit for the consumer. They benefit the consumer, and consumers will say yes. I think consumers will object to basically abuse of the data. And the challenge that every company has is basically approach it from the point of view that the customer owns their data, not from the point of view that I have the data, so I own it. In a sense, you don't. The assumption should be that the customer owns the data. If the customer owns the data, how do I create an offering, let's say along this line, that offer them a real benefit that they will be willing to say, yeah, go ahead and send me this information because it's valuable. Anyone feels that you will not be able to do it? And why not? Kind of follow this direction one, which is basically focus the innovation efforts on emerging customer needs, which involves, I want personalization, I want it in real time as part of my journey, and I want it to be trustworthy. Okay, if I don't see any problem with this, let's move to guideline 2. Leverage internal and external accelerators. The idea here is innovation can come from any place. And number one is very similar to the open innovation idea, but more specific to the idea of accelerators. Accelerators are really proven to be very, very successful. There are independent accelerators like Dreamit, if you want to do a website search on them, or actually most of the large high-tech firms have accelerators. The accelerators the large companies do, and it's interesting, in Israel there is a huge cluster of international high-tech firms, IBM, Apple, Facebook, all of them. And what all of them have is they're having these external accelerators. So they announce a topic that they're interested in. Let's say blockchain for financial services. And then they get applications from all the companies around the world that are working on blockchain in financial services. And then they can select the best one. And if you follow like the Dreamit model, they typically will be, well, you have 3 months, we'll provide you minimum amount of money, but provide you coaching and mentoring or whatever you need and connection. And in 3 months, we expect you to have a result. So in a sense, it's a great way to augment any kind of internal effort. It provides basically a way, as opposed to you have to go out and search who's doing what, to allow basically you become a magnet and basically attract all the other potential startups in the area that are doing work in this area. I think every company can do it. Even Grounds for Sculptures can do it. An accelerator in terms of, let's say, enhancing customer experience here. I try to invite companies to come and develop it. Questions? Anyone feels they cannot do it?
How is this different than a consultant?
Huge difference. Consultant, you select one guy or one company, they come give you their biased approach. The idea here is primarily open to the world. You're opening and you're saying, I'm interested in the blockchain for artists. How can they distribute frames for artists using blockchain? What are the implications? And you get all the startups around the world or people who are working in the area send you application. You select the most promising one. You bring them in. You provide the infrastructure. In 3 months, you have results. And then you can decide which of them I want to use. You may want to invest in some of them. Any number of opportunities. So it's a dramatically different approach than using kind of a single company as a consultant.
Are these all technology focused?
No. Doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be. We are using a modified version of a hackathon accelerators at the PMA. At the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we're using it. We're using, so there are a number of these examples. Yeah.
No, I just had a quick question, because you say internal and external. You've given examples there of internal ones. Are there many external ones?
Yeah.
Industry-wise?
Increasing one. So Dreamit is a good example. Dreamit started as a general one, but then they started focusing on industry-wide. So they're doing a lot in the healthcare area. So for example, they work with Penn and Penn Medicine, and then work together. So Penn Medicine can send one team, and Dreamit will select 9 external teams, bring them all in one large room with 10 tables. Each company has a table, but they have a lot of advisors who help and the like. Yeah.
So I'm not sure why I'm here because I'm an accountant by training and we don't innovate, but
We don't want you to innovate.
but when I'm looking at
He's the one exception, guys.
when I look at this, I can think of some. I make some angel investments, and I could really help them accelerate if I knew where to go to say, hey, you need to get in touch with these guys. How do I find for a particular topic? How do you find where these accelerators are?
Well, we have to thank our participant from Google. Start by Googling and saying, looking for accelerators in given area, look for, that simple. Google is amazing in terms of the search results. And basically think about going back to our trends of the future, in 3 to 5 years, when basically this will be based fully, all of the Google search will be based on AI or a Watson type system, where you will not just be listing, but actually validated information. This will be a true game changer. So the ability to search will be much easier. Okay, yeah.
Dreamit like Y Combinator?
I'm sorry.
Dreamit like Y Combinator? It's like a startup.
Dreamit is a company that manages accelerators. So they issue accelerators. Yeah, but you have a chance. The reason I'm giving you names all here, so you can later on go and search them. But basically, they continuously announce accelerators in specific domains, the healthcare, others. The third is to manage innovation as a portfolio encompassing all 3 innovation horizons, balancing organic growth with merger acquisition strategic alliance. It basically suggests the following. If you look at the offering, business model, or technology, there are 3 possibilities. Either I have it, it exists, someone else is using it, but I'm not, or it's new to the world. And when you look at markets, either markets I'm currently serving, market that exists that I don't serve, and new to the world markets. Okay? This creates 3 innovation horizons, 1, 2, 3. The idea is when you start thinking about experimentation and developing new ideas, start thinking about what will be ideas for each one of these markets. Also think in terms of a portfolio. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. But definitely, if you're just staying here, if you're just staying in Horizon 1, and 100% of your resources are here, you probably will be dead. So the idea will be don't spend more than 80 to 90% on Horizon 1. Make sure to spend somewhere between 10 and 20% of the resources, Horizon 2 and 3. And whatever you spend in Horizon 1, make sure that you're also experimenting with new approaches in Horizon 1. That's the whole idea of innovation. And when you think about investment in innovation as a portfolio, do it in terms of not only internal development, but also merger acquisitions and strategic alliances. Okay? Straightforward? The fourth idea is to challenge the business models and leverage your dormant network. And that's actually the data I showed you before. So we covered it before, but the idea is when you are focusing on innovation, don't forget to innovate with respect to business models. And this is an example. We talked about 10 different business models here, showing only 4. And basically that the results are different. And then definitely don't forget the network orchestration.
Are you saying that any business can be a network orchestration?
Every business has networks. So every business can engage in networks, And then the challenge is to think about how do you create a platform to monetize the networks you have. The beauty here was in the examples that we currently have for network orchestration is that all of them were able to develop a technology platform that allowed them to do it. But if you're dealing with a different situation, how can you create, basically open it broader, not only thinking in terms of technology platform, but ask the question, how can I monetize, once I energize the network and engage them, how can I monetize it? Okay, and so, and start thinking about clients, former clients, suppliers, distributors, employees, all the networks that you have. Are you engaging them? Are you monetizing them? And part of it will be actually creating an ecosystem around it.
Do companies need to prioritize and invest in open APIs in order to enable this?
Definitely it will help. It definitely will help. Definitely the open innovation will help. The open innovation will really help when you have an open API. In general, the rule is I would always prefer open system over closed system. And I'll give you an example in terms of there's a great kind of old example. Two blood analyzing systems were developed and entered the market about the same time. One system was a closed system where the company controlled all the new innovation, R&D around it. The other one was an open system that encouraged the users to develop innovation. End of year one, system one, the closed one, had about 3 new innovations. The open system had like 20 new blood tests. It's almost a no-brainer. Why open system is better than a closed system. I'll skip this. If you're interested in the network area, there's a whole book we wrote about the network imperative, discussing some network for principles of success. But the 5th one will be foster internal and external talent. This is an important area. That's the point we discussed before, which says when you look at talent, don't look at this only to hire, but also in terms of how do I connect with talent around the world. Basically, the open innovation applied to talent, and how to identify, recruit, develop, manage, retain the creative talent that I need. Incidentally, anyone knows what this is? What is this billboard? Billboard. Yeah, a billboard on 101 in California looking for talent. If you can solve this problem, call us. We need your talent. 6, create a creative culture. Culture is key. If you don't have a creative culture, the innovation will not really work. And here are some examples from a number of companies that really were able to create a truly creative culture. I'm bringing in the Bloomberg headquarters in New York, which is kind of totally with glass and open, the whole idea of transparency as part of the culture. Yeah.
Truly an environmental exercise in terms of we can all bring in like orange chairs and take away the cubicles.
By itself, it will not work. With it, it will help enormously. With physical environment is important. Physical interaction is important. I'll give you an example how important it is. So we talked before about 24/7 R&D development around the world. Companies that tried it by having 3 teams that never had any contact between them before and have only virtual content are not as successful as teams that basically you bring them together, they spend some time together and develop interpersonal relations in addition to the virtual one. So absolutely, physical is not the only element. Culture is really key. It's culture and values and how do you develop it. We need a week session just on this by itself if we want to do it, but primarily the physical environment is very, very important aspect because it signals and sends a message how to deal with this. So for example, at SEI, in this picture you cannot see it so much, it's a financial service company outside Philadelphia. They have one of the largest collections of contemporary art in the world. Over 3,000 art pieces, which is all over the offices. Through the campus is about 9 buildings. And there's art everywhere. And the idea of the art is to encourage the employees to challenge what they're doing. So look at the way this artist challenged whatever this artist did. Why won't you challenge your work, the same way? So primarily they use art as a metaphor for trying to help create a more innovative environment. We talked about open innovation, so I will not repeat it, but here are some examples for our discussion before. Absolutely critical. 8 will be follow best practices and get the needed buy-in. So there's a lot of work, a lot of publications about best practice in innovation. I like as simple as this, is the 3M, that says the key is to change the base of competition. Doing anything legally and ethically that upsets the status quo, change the rules of the game, and increase our value to the customers, and thereby resulting in a novel and powerful competitive advantage that is difficult for competition to respond to. Simple. SEI vision statement, the mission of SEI is even simpler than this. Help our clients succeed. They're dealing only in the B2B world, have a simple message, simple mission, help our clients succeed. Everything is being judged. Whatever you propose, whatever you're doing, does it help our clients succeed? If it doesn't help our clients succeed, forget it.
Well, Jerry, that's ours as well. Helping businesses succeed online.
That's great. Well, I think you should expand this to omni-channel. Yeah.
Are we also making an assumption in some of these, like if we look at 3M, they have self-directed work teams. So to really upset the status quo and to do a lot of this, would you feel that in the majority of those organizations, they are self-directed? They're not, your standard functional type of structures?
Everything we talk about is interrelated. Definitely, self-directed teams will help. My view of self-directed teams is actually a great example from Google, which I don't know to what extent you still do it. But they used to, so update me here, they used to actually allow engineers to select what they want to work on, and allowing you to work as a certain amount of time on whatever you want to do. And if you had a really big idea, if you sold 2 or 3 other people as a team, they will even provide funding in addition to just time to try to do it. Do they still do it?
Yeah.
So to me, that's probably the best thing, because imagine the following. How many of you, incidentally, in your organizations, you ask people what they would like to do, and then you assign them to do what they would like to do? As opposed to say, here's the job description, come work on the job description. Think about the difference when basically you can work on what you really are passionate about and want to work on.
Yeah, some of Google's best products have come from those 100% projects.
This is also similar, I think what Google does is what MasterCard did in New York City, right? They have their own lab. Kind of like you just talked about the environment. They have their own barista, they have their own really cool looking facility.
Yep.
But then they follow the idea funnel. So there's 3 parts to that funnel, which really helped to trigger them from just being, hey, we're a payment processor, we can't continue to compete, how do we compete? And thereby going to that innovation.
And the example I gave you, the combination of MasterCard and American Airlines, came out of this lab. And again, the point of this kind of guideline is, guys, let's not ignore what works for other companies, what people are putting together a lot of thought. So let's open ourselves to really understand what's there, as opposed to this is the only way of doing things. 9, still we need incentive and reward. Guys, you have to provide incentive and reward innovation. 10 is you have to create an agile organizational architecture that enhances innovation and facilitates bridging the different silos. One of the big problems of not having large companies innovate is because there are silos. And each silo, each business unit is trying to develop their own innovation area. There's huge duplication, the overlap. They don't try to leverage their kind of experience across. So bridging the silos is really a critical area. And the entire organizational architecture has to be geared toward primarily supporting innovation. So it means both from the culture, the values, the structure, the process, the people, the facilities, the resources, technology, the very important performance measures and incentive. And I'm putting it all in the context of a network. So even though we're focusing on organizational architecture, how do you create it as part of an ecosystem that you're creating? 11 will be adopt a new leadership model and think about leaders as investors. Remember Jim's discussion today as a VC primarily. As co-creators, that's critical because if we're talking about collaboration, if you talk about co-creating with customers, you need a leader who's basically focusing on co-creating and primarily as a network orchestrator. So you really need a new type of leadership model to try to deal with the environment. And the final guideline is basically the adaptive experimentation approach. And the idea here is very simple. If you imagine that I'm spending X millions of dollars, let's say, on advertising or whatever, Salesforce, whatever I do, at the end of the year, I'm getting this result. What should I do next year? Should I increase my budget, decrease, or keep it the same level? The answer is I don't know. The answer is, the only answer is I don't know. And what does it mean? It means that I wasted a whole year because at the end of the year, I'm no smarter than I was at the beginning of the year. The only way I can basically make sense out of this is to design experiment. In some markets, go half X, some 2X, and see what the results are. If these are the results, continue X. If these are the results, go 3X, 4X next year. If these are the results, 3X and perhaps a quarter X. And you don't have to limit experimentation to a simple one variable. You can basically come up with a different experimental design focusing on multiple variables. That's a Latin square design. And when you think about this, primarily, experimentation has huge amount of benefits. So let's just take a minute time to reflect benefits of experimentation. What are the key benefits of experimentation? Louder.
New products.
The results will be we'll be able to develop new products. What else?
Better insights.
New insights, understanding what really works. That really learning is the key benefit, the learning what works. Keep in mind, experimentation is the only way to determine causality. Everything else is inferential, it's correlational. The only way is through experimentation. So basically, that's the only way to really learn to know what works or doesn't work, which has huge implication in terms of other benefits. What are the other benefits? Yeah.
A sense of ownership for being part of the experiment.
Because you engage people, right? You get better buy-in and get better engage people. You'll also be able to get a very important benefit. You get better talent because people will be willing to do it. What other major benefit of experimentation?
Optimization. Product optimization.
Okay, let's expand this to better decisions, okay? Because I know the causal relation, I can come up with better decision. This will be part of the better decision. What else? Allow me to speed to market, especially if I'm doing experimentation, not only as a little test, as a pretest, but really as basically the entire experimental strategy. What else? Yeah.
It combats against highest paid opinion or cultural norms where you get kind of pushed to do things because you've always done them.
It's
When
data-based.
it says X, so you do it.
It's data-based decision. It's fact-based decision as opposed to just all the other biases here. What else? What else? Most important, guys, most importantly, it creates a culture of innovation. Because what it does, if you promote experimentation, and everyone knows that not every experiment will succeed, you're sending a message to the organization that says it's okay to fail. You're legitimizing failure. It's okay to fail, but what have we learned from here? It's not whether we succeeded or not, but what have we learned from this specific experiment? And then once we know, everyone knows that it's okay to fail, they'll have the courage to start challenging the status quo. And this will lead you then to being able to get better talent, because the better talent will be attracted to an environment like this. You'll be able to create the culture. This is even more important than having the furniture or the building. If you talk about determinant of culture, this will determine the culture. a culture of experimentation, continuously challenging the status quo. And also will give you a huge competitive advantage, because in a competitive market, if you're going with a more complex experiment, you're the only one who knows the research design, the experimental design. Competitors can see input and output. They cannot link the two because they don't have the experimental design. So huge benefits of experimentation. How many of you are using experimentation on an ongoing basis? Show of hands. Guys, everyone should engage in experimentation. So these are the 12 guidelines. Questions on any of them? Okay, so let's do the following. We are almost running out of time. Let's take 3 minutes, quiet time at each one of the tables, and try to think about, of these or any of the other items we discussed today, what is the one thing you're going to try to experiment with when you're going back to work? And you can discuss among yourselves. So let's take 3 minutes to try to discuss it, and then I will ask few of you to try to share it, and then we'll close. Okay. So that's really a good kind of illustration of, kind of some possible experiments or action based on this. So why don't you take a piece of paper or your smartphone and take 60 seconds and jot down what are you going to do differently as a result of our session? What are you going to do differently as a result of which means, are you using any one of these 12 ideas, or using any of the implications of the force of change we discussed today? Are you using any of the ideas from the different business models we talked about, the challenging of the mental models? So what actions are you going to do as a result of our session? At least one concrete action, ideally structured as an experiment. So you'll be able to determine, does it work, doesn't it work, what is the incremental impact of this initiative compared to what you've been doing before. Okay. Feel free to continue writing other ideas you have. It doesn't have to be limited to one, but hopefully you'll be able to implement one. And I hope that this was helpful. And try to avoid the situation where in your organization, someone is pushing and someone is pulling it, but the organization does not have the most smooth wheels. Now, the talent that you have in the organization definitely has the right wheels. So make sure to, how do you replace the kind of what you currently have, squeaky wheels in this organization with the ones that go smooth? And this typically requires challenging and changing the manual and operation you have. I hope this was helpful as guidelines and you'll be able to move forward. If you have any questions on any of the items we discussed, I have tons of publications on many aspects of this. Send me an email. It's on the presentation that you get from here. And continue to enjoy the rest of the program. Thank you.